The nuclear age is quietly breaking. Here's the contradiction most people haven't noticed yet. Global tensions are rising, but the systems designed to keep them from exploding are disappearing. On February 4, 2026, the last binding agreement limiting the nuclear weapons of the United States and Russia expires. For the first time in more than 50 years, the world's two largest nuclear powers will operate with no legal limits at all. That's not a policy detail. That's a structural shift. Because when there are no limits, everything else starts to move faster. Decisions get shorter, assumptions replace facts, and the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. This affects you even if you never think about nuclear weapons. These treaties don't prevent war by goodwill. They prevent war by reducing panic, misreading, and overreaction in moments when leaders have minutes, not days, to decide what to do next. Inspections have already stopped. Data exchanges have already gone dark. What's holding things together right now isn't law, it's habit. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud yet. This breakdown didn't begin in 2026, it began earlier, and what comes next is already taking shape. What's happening now isn't a single deadline quietly approaching. It's the final stage of a longer unraveling. The treaty expiring in 2026 was signed in 2010, extended once in 2021, and for years it functioned as the central stabilizer between Washington and Moscow. It capped deployed warheads, it capped launch systems, and just as important, it forced both sides to constantly show their work, but only part of that system is still standing. In February 2023, Russia suspended its participation. Inspections stopped, notifications stopped. The United States responded by suspending its own participation. The machinery that made limits real was effectively switched off, even though the numbers technically remained in place. This is why treating 2026 as an isolated event misses the pattern. The collapse didn't arrive suddenly. It's been unfolding step by step, with each layer of transparency peeled away and normalized. What once required verification now relies on trust. What was enforceable is now voluntary. And that raises a dangerous question most coverage skips over. If both sides are already operating without proof, what actually changes when the limits disappear entirely? The critical claim here is simple, and it changes how you see everything that follows. The nuclear order hasn't collapsed yet because neither side believes breaking it is worth the risk, for now. Even after inspections were suspended, both Washington and Moscow continued signaling that they were staying within the central limits. Deployed warheads remained capped. Launchers stayed under agreed numbers. On the surface, stability held. But notice what made that possible. Not enforcement, not verification, signaling. Both sides are watching each other indirectly through satellites, public statements, forced posture changes. That works only as long as neither side thinks the other is preparing a breakout. The moment that perception shifts, the logic collapses. Here's the detail that matters most. The treaty didn't just limit weapons. It removed ambiguity. It told planners exactly what the other side could and could not do. Without inspections, that certainty is gone. Without legal limits, even the pretense disappears. Now watch what's missing. There is no replacement framework, no backup agreement, no active negotiation channel defining what comes next. So the current calm isn't proof the system is working. It's proof the system hasn't been tested yet. And this is where the story flips. Because once restraint becomes optional, the first side to move gains leverage, and the second side is forced to follow. What happens next follows a familiar pattern, even if the setting feels new. When limits fade, behavior slowly adjusts. Not overnight, not with an announcement, but through normalization. Once inspection stopped, the idea of operating without verification stopped sounding extreme. Once participation was suspended, the idea of operating without a treaty stopped sounding radical. Each step lowered the psychological barrier to the next. This has happened before. During earlier arms race cycles, the absence of constraints didn't trigger immediate explosions. It triggered quiet expansion, hedging, and worst-case planning. Leaders didn't rush to build everything at once. They prepared for the possibility that the other side might. That's the escalation most people miss. It's not loud, it's procedural. Strategic planners stop asking, what is the other side allowed to have, and start asking, what could they have if they wanted to? And here's why that matters. Systems designed under limits behave very differently when those limits vanish. Upload capacity becomes relevant, storage becomes strategic, production timelines shorten. This is where the abnormal starts to feel normal. Planning for unconstrained nuclear competition becomes routine. Budgets adjust, doctrines shift, language hardens, and once that mindset locks in, reversing it becomes far harder than preventing it in the first place. Now watch how this escalation accelerates, because the next layer doesn't come from missiles, it comes from politics. The next proof is more unsettling because it exposes a direct contradiction between what leaders say and what their systems are doing. In September 2025, Vladimir Putin proposed a one-year voluntary extension of the treaty's core limits. Not a renegotiation, not a reset, just a temporary pause to keep the numbers frozen. Donald Trump publicly called the idea a good idea. On the surface, that sounds like alignment, but nothing followed. No negotiations were launched, no framework was built. Moscow later signaled that it didn't even know who the US interlocutor was supposed to be. The offer existed in public language, but not in operational reality. At the same time, the United States accelerated plans for advanced missile defense under what's been described as the Golden Dome Initiative. Publicly, missile defense is framed as protection. Strategically, it changes everything. Here's the contradiction. While signaling interest in restraint, Washington pursued systems that adversaries interpret as enabling first strike advantage. Moscow has been explicit for years that offensive reductions are inseparable from limits on missile defense. So watch what this enables. If defenses expand and offensive limits vanish, the rational response is not restraint, it's expansion. More warheads, more delivery systems, more ways to overwhelm a shield that offers no guarantee of success. This is the line that permanently reframes the issue. What's driving the collapse isn't failure to talk, it's incentives that reward not talking. And once those incentives take hold, the system doesn't drift towards stability, it accelerates away from it. Now the pressure starts stacking fast. First, missile defense plans accelerate, not slow down. The Golden Dome Initiative moves forward as limits on offensive systems fade, tightening the security dilemma. Defensive systems on paper translate into offensive pressure in practice. Second, China enters the picture indirectly. US political rhetoric begins framing any future agreement as incomplete unless Beijing is included. That sounds reasonable until you look at the numbers. China's arsenal sits far below US and Russian levels, and Beijing has been clear it won't cap itself while that gap exists. Third, the clock keeps ticking. No inspections, no active talks, no successor framework. Just an expiration date getting closer while assumptions harden on all sides. None of these developments alone trigger a crisis. Together, they compress decision-making time. They push planners toward hedging strategies. They reward readiness over restraint. This is how control slips, not through a single dramatic break, but through overlapping pressures that remove flexibility. Once worst-case planning becomes standard, every ambiguous move looks hostile. Every silence looks intentional. And here's the question that can't be avoided anymore. At some point, this stops being abstract. This is where it reaches you. When nuclear limits disappear, governments don't just adjust warhead counts, they adjust priorities. Budgets shift. Military readiness rises. Diplomatic risk tolerance drops. And those changes show up in ordinary life long before any missile ever moves. Periods of nuclear instability don't stay contained inside briefing rooms. They bleed into markets, energy prices, insurance costs, and crisis politics. When leaders assume the world is less predictable, they act faster and explain less. Emergency language becomes routine. Security exceptions multiply. In an unconstrained environment, every international shock feels heavier. A regional conflict escalates faster. A misread radar signal carries more weight. A political crisis turns into a strategic one with fewer off-ramps. And the most dangerous part is how familiar this begins to feel. You don't wake up one day and notice nuclear instability. You adapt to it, Tension becomes background noise, risk becomes normal. If this sounds familiar, say so in the comments, because for millions of people it already does. And that's the trap. The more normalized instability becomes, the harder it is to reverse, which leads to the deeper question most coverage avoids. Why does the system keep allowing this to happen? The answer isn't chaos, it's structure. This keeps happening because the system rewards certain behaviors and punishes others. Restraint requires trust, time, and political patience. Expansion requires none of those. It only requires suspicion. Arms control doesn't fail because leaders forget how dangerous nuclear weapons are. It fails because incentives shift. When transparency disappears, uncertainty grows. When uncertainty grows, leverage becomes more valuable than limits. And when leverage matters more than stability, escalation becomes rational. Missile defense plays a central role here. Even systems that offer no guarantee of protection still change calculations. They create pressure to overwhelm, diversify, and accelerate. The result isn't safety, it's speed. Spectacle matters too. Declaring a tougher posture signals strength domestically, even if it weakens stability internationally. Walking away from limits looks decisive. Preserving them looks passive. That asymmetry shapes political behavior. Here's the unsettling insight. No one has to want collapse for it to happen. The system can drift there simply by following its incentives. And once the machinery of escalation is moving, stopping it requires more effort than letting it run. Which means the future isn't decided by one dramatic choice. It's being shaped by a series of smaller ones already underway. From here, the path forward splits, but neither direction is clean. One possibility is managed drift. No treaty replaces the old one, but informal restraint holds. Numbers creep upward quietly. Upload capacity grows. Missile defense expands. Risk is managed through signaling and crisis hotlines, not law. Stability exists, but it's thinner, more brittle, and far more dependent on personalities in power. The other path is faster and more dangerous. A visible build-up by one side triggers a response from the other. Warheads are uploaded, delivery systems multiply. China accelerates its expansion, not because it wants parity, but because unconstrained superpowers leave it no alternative. Worst-case planning becomes policy. Neither outcome requires a single reckless decision. Momentum does the work. Once budgets, doctrines, and timelines shift, reversing course becomes politically costly. Walking back escalation looks like weakness. Continuing it looks prudent. And notice the timing. All of this unfolds while diplomatic channels are thin and trust is minimal. That means the next major crisis doesn't arrive with clear signals or agreed rules. It arrives into a system already stretched. The next move isn't theoretical. It's forming right now, shaped by choices most people never see. What this story really shows isn't a treaty expiring. It's a world quietly switching from rules to reactions. For decades, nuclear stability rested on something fragile but powerful: predictability. Limits didn't eliminate danger, but they slowed it down. They bought time. They reduced the chances that fear, misreading, or pride would make a permanent decision in a temporary moment. As those limits fade, the risk isn't just bigger arsenals, it's faster escalation in a system with fewer breaks and less clarity. The danger isn't that someone wants catastrophe, it's that the system no longer works hard enough to prevent it. This isn't the end of the story, it's the setup for the next phase. If you want to understand how power really moves when rules disappear and what comes after this nuclear moment, follow and subscribe. Because what happens next won't be announced, it will unfold.